Uh-oh. It seems I have a little bit of a technical difficulty here. Let's see what's going on.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry for some technical difficulties. We are all set and ready to go. Thank you for tuning in today. We have Tony McNichol. He is a commissioned staff member who's our cultural resource specialist, and he's going to talk about the Revolutionary War and the privateers of the Mullica River. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony.
All right. Thanks, Joel. Okay, good morning to all. And thanks for joining us for this installment of the Pinelands Commission free Year the Earth Stood Still webinar series. I'd like to give a shout out to the communications department, particularly Joel Mott, who you just heard, for doing such a great job pulling all this together in these difficult times. We really appreciate the time he's put into making this series a success. If you're from the area, you may recognize Joel's surname, Mott, from such topographic features as Mott's Creek and Mott's Creek Road in Galway. His family's been in the area for quite a long time, and he's got some great stories about that. So my name is Tony McNichol, and I am the archaeologist and cultural resources planner for the New Jersey Pinelands Commission, as Joel mentioned. The title of this particular presentation is His Majesty's Infernal Nuisance, the Colonial Privateers of the Mullica. I also just wanted to note, my mom reminded me today that today is my grandfather's birthday. He's been gone quite a while now, but he was a frogman in World War II and a member of Underwater Demolition Team 2 in the Pacific Theater, which were basically the progenitors of the SEALs. So it's neat to kind of note the lineage of these colonial era privateers and their relationship to the formal Navy, which was something my grandfather would have been very interested in. There's a lot of information in this presentation, and the more you kind of pick at it, I found the more potential research topics open up. So before we jump in, of course, I just need some humor these days, so we're going to start in with a couple of jokes. So pirates, right? Who doesn't love pirates? What's a pirate's favorite letter? Of course, it's R. Why don't pirates shower before they walk the plank? Because they'll wash up on shore later. And lastly, what do you call a pirate with 2 eyes and 2 legs? A rookie. I hope people were laughing on the other end. But that was a test. This presentation is about privateers, and pirates are the next presentation over. There is a difference. We'll get to what that difference is soon. I just wanted to reiterate that this is an incredibly rich and interesting topic, and one really can't talk about privateering in this region without talking about Great Bay, Little Egg Harbor, and the Mullica River. I should also point out from a research perspective that there are several fantastic sources on the Mullica area and privateering, as well as broader works that you should check out if you hadn't already and are interested in the things that we talk about today. There's Arthur Pierce's Smuggler's Woods, the really comprehensive and I think unparalleled Heart of the Pines by John Pierce, which is a wide-ranging breakdown not only of Pineland's history, but the family name connections in the region. And also there's this great book, indispensable really, called A Nest of Rebel Pirates by Franklin Kemp, which is dedicated to the story of the Battle of Chestnut Neck, which involved many local privateers, and as you likely know, occurred right around where the Garden State Parkway now crosses the Mullica River. So to talk about privateering in the region, we'll certainly have to talk about that as well. Also, you can just do a privateer search on Amazon. You'll find some really great books, some of the current research and syntheses. And if people want to email me at some point in the future to get some of these references that I use for this, please feel free to do so at tony.mcnichol, McNichol, @pinelands.nj.gov. Okay, so before we delve into the privateering, let's go back a bit in history to the 17th century and introduce the namesake of the river where so many of these Red War privateers later operated so effectively. Eric Paulson Mullica. Mullica, as I say in my classy Philly accent, was born in Sweden in 1636, and he was often mistakenly identified as a Swede, though as my Finnish friend Pia has informed me every time I've mentioned his name in her presence, he is culturally a Finn. She also takes care to correct how I say it. Mullica, she demonstrates for me, slowly while pointing to the edges of her mouth. His name means young bull. There are no known images of Mullica, but we do know that he arrived in the New World to the colony of New Sweden on the vessel Eagle, which sailed from Gothenburg in 1654. This is a map showing New Sweden, which occupied portions of what are now the states of Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. And you can see all these wonderful Lenape names along the river. I apologize if the resolution is not very good. I'll try to point, though. Let's do this here. Okay. So there are all these great Lenape names, and you'll now hear me tragically mispronounce several of them. There is the Kakaman Sea, which was later called Shakamaxon. This was the site that we all know of William Penn's famous treaty in what is now the Fishtown neighborhood of Philadelphia. Further north is the Panicpacicle Creek, or the Pennypack, as it's known today. And right in the middle here, right there, is where Mullica initially settled when he arrived here. All right, so here's an early 1702 engraving done by Thomas Campanius Hull, depicting New Sweden and convivial relations between the Lenape and the Swedes, which was not always the case. Holt had never actually been to the colony, and this engraving was done about 50 years after New Sweden fell apart. To drive this point home, note the indigenous Pennsylvania palm tree in the bottom left of the image. As I mentioned, good relations between the Swedes and the Lenape were not the rule by any stretch of the imagination. Certainly, when you compare them with the early Quaker experiences with them, and particularly William Penn's dealings, it's safe to say things were relatively stable in the Philadelphia area with the Lenape until Penn's greedy sons kind of screwed them over with the notorious walking purchase in 1737. So Mullica was married to a woman named Ingrid Philipson, who herself arrived in 1656 on the ship Mercurius. They had 8 children. They were granted 950 acres in the village of Tacony, or Towakamwanink, which translates into wilderness in Lenape. And the Philadelphia neighborhood retains that name today, as does the bridge that crosses there into New Jersey. This is a slide that shows the area in Tacony, close to the now sewered Sissawakinink or Wissinoming Creek, where Mullica's original homestead and farm was established. Just as an aside, to underline the current strangeness of that once densely forested area is an abandoned columbarium, or a cremains receptacle, on the opposite corner from that first shot, in the midst of all this industrial sprawl, which again is not far from the Wissinoming Creek, and where it was long covered over, where Mullica's farmstead was located. Very strange area indeed. We know very little about Mullica's life in Tacony, other than he was reported to be the road keeper there, responsible for maintaining all the roads from the village of Tacony northwards. There's a chance that stylistically his house in Tacony may have looked something like this. This is the C.A. Nothnagle house in Gibbstown, near Swedesboro, built by Finns in 1638. It's one of the oldest surviving log houses in the US, and the original structure was built with oak logs with no nails, only dovetail joints and wooden pegs. So this sort of traditional construction would have been brought over to New Sweden with the immigrants. And it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility that Mullica would have built his own home in this fashion or similar fashion. We do know that Mullica's wife Ingrid dies in Tacony, and that he eventually remarries. And not long after this, he picks up, for reasons unknown, and moves out into another virtual wilderness near present-day Lower Bank in the Pinelands. And he carves himself out a new homestead and a new life with his children along the banks of the river, which will eventually bear his name. He's supposed to be the first European to settle in that area. So Mullica himself dies sometime before 1704. 4 of his sons purchased land early on along Raccoon Creek in Gloucester County, and they built farmhouses in what is now the town of Mullica Hill. And you can still see one of them, over 300 years old, at 20 North Main Street in Mullica Hill. There's just something about that finished construction that holds up. Before we go on, I just want to say that the research optimist in me hopes that somewhere out there in an attic, in the rafters of an old building, like in an old trunk or repository, there are unknown diaries, deeds, maps, or other ephemera related to Eric Mullica's life. Oh, I'm sorry, Mullica. Why did Mullica pack up and leave Tacony for a place that had been seen by few, if any, European eyes? Presumably, Eric knew the Lenape. He likely had dealings with them on a regular basis. Did he befriend them, speak their language? Could he have been taken deep into the interior on hunting trips or expeditions, fallen in love with the country and decided to go there with his family after all speculation, of course? Was it primarily the arrival of the English and the marginalization of the original European settlers that facilitated his departure? It is a story largely untold, and one still, I think, of great historic interest. But something happened there that we don't know. Someone must have told him about that area that attracted him. And perhaps it was already being used as a way into the interior, as it was later on. And there may have been money and fortunes to be made there. We just don't know. Okay, so we've had I've had our Eric Mullica fix and background. So let's move on. And we will, of course, return to the Mullica River soon. So what is a privateer? 19th century writer Gomer Williams described a privateer as such. Your true privateer was a sort of half horse, half alligator, with a streak of lightning in his composition, generally with a superabundance of whiskey, as if he held with Samson that his strength was in the quantity of his hair. So here we have Edward Thatch, or Edward Teach, Blackbeard, pirate or privateer. This is an image of Thatch, also occasionally referred to as Teach, and the truth is that it's not exactly certain what his actual name was. Most people have a general sense of his life and exploits, and it's fair to say that he was indeed a pirate, though at one point in his career he may have worked briefly as a privateer, though this definition is a slippery one at times, depending on whose side you're ultimately on. This image here reflects his recorded propensity for tying slow-burning fuses into his beard, laced with cannon powder, to produce terrifying effect when boarding someone's ship after a battle. He was killed in 1718 in Ocracoke, North Carolina, and his severed head was displayed on the bowsprit of Lieutenant Robert Maynard's ship, the Pearl. A dangerous business, pirating and privateering. So in short and overarchingly, a privateer is distinguished from a pirate, someone like Thatch, or half alligator, half horse, by the formal sanctioning of their activities by a government or a legislative authority. And by that, I mean the form that this kind of permission took was the issuance of what were called letters of marque. That is an official letter of marque. On March 23rd, 1776, the Continental Congress resolved that, and I quote, "The inhabitants of these colonies be permitted to fit out armed vessels to cruise on the enemies of these United States." And the letter of marque was the formal agreement between Congress and a privateer for their services harassing the enemy's business interests, basically. Congress issued almost 1,700 of these letters of marque during the Red War, and over 70,000 men served aboard privateer ships. And you compare this to the official Continental Navy at the time, which had 340 officers and 3,000 men. This particular letter of marque describes quite well what the privateer was sanctioned to do, and also what the restrictions were on their behavior, restrictions that would not be in place were you a pirate. So I'll summarize some of it here. Quote, "You may by force of arms attack, subdue, and take all things and other vessels belonging to the crown of Great Britain, or any of the subjects thereof on the high seas or between high and low water marks. You must pay a sacred regard to the rights of neutral powers and the usage and customs of civilized nations. You shall bring such ships and vessels as are taken to convenient ports for processing. And if you or any of your officers or crew shall in cold blood kill or maim, or by torture otherwise cruelly, inhumanely, and contrary to the civilized nations in war, mistreat any person on the vessel you shall take, the offender shall be seriously punished." So this last bit there alone brings out in relief the kind of existential difference between a pirate and a privateer. In fact, Benjamin Franklin was on record as saying that the value of privateering was ultimately less about making money and or diverting supplies, but was more about taking valuable prisoners, officers, government officials, etc., as human assets to bring the crown to its knees. Privateers themselves seem to have taken the restrictions seriously for the most part, and some even reveled in their portrayal as gentlemen rakes of the sea. There is one account of a privateer who captured a supply ship with a wealthy British woman on board who was being transported to the home of her fiance in the colonies. And to her surprise, she received a personal letter of apology from the privateer a month after the haul, along with funds sufficient to replace all of her goods that had been taken in the raid. So here we have an extremely rare 18th century photo of the moment the privateer met the socialite aboard the captured ship. And note that the privateer bears an uncanny resemblance to Errol Flynn. It's very strange. God, I hope people were laughing out there. So as I'll talk about in a bit more detail later, the Mullica region has a smuggling pedigree before the war even begins, and folks in the area had become adept at avoiding the tax collectors. By the time of the early Rev War, it could be said that the region was actually prosperous, while Philadelphia was suffering from the British blockades that were then in place. Also, there was already a precedent for American shipbuilding, and a large percentage of British merchant ships had been produced in the colonies. Shipbuilding and outfitting was already a pretty well-established industry in the Mullica River region. It's likely not surprising that privateering was a logical extension of this industry, combined with a pre-existing local stubbornness and disdain for the heavy hand of the British government. The estimated total value of privateering efforts on British commerce and stores was between $15 and $60 million, and this is likely a conservative estimate. And understand here, this is almost an astronomical amount of damage if we convert these numbers to modern currency figures, literally billions of dollars. Causing this guy, and if you're sitting there in your house alone and you want something to do, just feel free to let loose and give this guy a hearty boo or a hiss. Causing this guy, King George III, to have frequent paroxysms over colonial privateering on the high seas. It's estimated that 10% or more of all cargo sent to the colonies, 10% in British ships during the Rev War, was intercepted by privateers and actually rerouted to Washington's troops and to the general civilian war effort. One particular cutter, the Revenge, elicited an almost maniacal obsession with the British to bring her to bear. The Revenge at one point had single-handedly captured 60 British vessels, destroying 33 of them, and sending the other 27 to colonial ports as prizes. The Revenge eventually arrived in Philadelphia in 1779, laden with captured arms, and was sold to a firm of Philadelphia merchants and set to protecting the shipping lanes in the Delaware River. Colonial privateers at this time were viewed overwhelmingly with pride, and there are descriptions of visitors to Philadelphia noting the colorful displays along the docks and the privateer ships that were looking for crews along the river. As the war ramped up, people had been lining up to attach themselves to a successful privateer vessel, and the captains didn't have to do much to convince experienced and inexperienced men, and probably women and children to a lesser extent, alike to come aboard. The following quote is from a recruitment ad in a Boston newspaper of the time for a crew to man the privateer Dean. So the quote starts, "An invitation to all brave seamen and Marines who have the inclination to serve their country and make their fortunes. The grand privateer ship Dean, commanded by Elisha Hinman and proved to be a very capital sailor, will sail on a cruise against the enemies of the United States of America by the 20th instant. The Dean mounts 30 carriage guns and is excellently well calculated for attacks, defense, and pursuit. This notice, therefore, is to invite all those jolly fellows who love their country and want to make their fortunes at one stroke to repair immediately to the rendezvous at the head of His Excellency Governor Hancock's wharf, where they will be received with a hearty welcome by a number of brave fellows there assembled and treated with that excellent liquor called grog, which is allowed by all true seamen to be the liquor of life." Well, they've got grog, so we have to sign up, right? So this is another privateer recruitment broadsheet or broadside from early on in the war. And notice the emphasis, again, is on making your fortune fast. So now fitting for a privateer in the harbor of Beverly, the brigantine Washington, a strong, good vessel for that purpose and a prime sailor. Any seamen or landmen that have an inclination to make their fortunes in a few months may have an opportunity by applying to John Dyson. Beverly Harbor is in Massachusetts, and I think it was the launch site of the armed schooner Hannah the year before, which was actually the first official U.S. Navy vessel. The colonies had gone basically privateering mad, and by 1780, many privateer ships sailed with more farmers on them than sailors, and that's kind of intimated here in this broadsheet, where they say seamen or landmen. A lot of people just came in from the countryside and got on these things, hoping to make their fortunes. So let's start to bring the privateering effort back into the local sphere. We know what a pirate looks like. We saw Blackbeard. So what then does a privateer look like? Not Errol Flynn. At least a privateer financier anyway. Let's see here. We've got Stephen Gerrard. You may have heard of this man, a bit more respectable. This is Stephen Gerrard, the famous merchant and philanthropist who at one point in the early 19th century was called the richest man in America. And he almost single-handedly funded the War of 1812 through his bank. And Gerrard got his start as a merchant in Philadelphia and a dabbler in privateering during the Rev War, though his investments at the time were surprisingly far less successful than most. He had purchased a ship called the Minerva that was captured and re-outfitted at Chestnut Neck. And it was just a disaster for him, basically. The Minerva failed, all the outfitting failed on it, the caulk popped out and fell out, and the workers were always sick. And Gerrard, after trying a few times to kind of get ships out and get them into the privateering game, just gets out of it entirely and goes on to other things. But along with Gerrard, there were many local Philadelphia investors who paid for the outfitting of privateer ships that ultimately operated out of the Mullica and other colonial ports. Washington, Adams, and Hancock all had their own fleets of privateer ships or supported privateers in general. We also have William Bingham, who was a U.S. congressman and a senator. And he made a fortune from the privateering efforts of the war. And early on, he worked in tandem with French merchants to capture British ships and harass supply lines. This painting was actually done by Gilbert Stuart, who is, of course, famous for his unfinished painting of George Washington. At one point, Williamingham was also called the richest man in the colonies. Let's see here. Of course, there's Robert Morris, the superintendent of finance for the nascent nation, who was also in charge at one point of the Continental Navy through the Agency of Marine. Ironically, Morris made a fortune during the war, but he lost almost all of it in land speculation in the late 1790s. The privateers were performing on the sea the kinds of operations that patriots such as Ethan Allen were engaged in on land, who sort of looks like Toby from The Office. Confiscating property from loyalists, which was often done, and denying the enemy the satisfaction of comfort and ease within the colonies, in a state of near constant harassment. There's, as an aside, there's actually a funny story about Ethan Allen from after the Rev War. He was visiting a friend in London who had hosted a dinner party for him. At one point, he excused himself from the table and he went out to use the outhouse. And he noted that several people at the table began to snicker behind their hands and sort of cast glances at each other across the table when he excused himself. So when he went out to the outhouse, he saw that there was a print of George Washington hanging prominently on the back wall of the outhouse, just above the toilet. So he finished up, he went back to the table and he sat down, continued dinner, and said nothing. So not being able to bear it anymore, his host asked him, "So, Ethan, what did you think of our portrait in the outhouse?" And Allen, without skipping a beat, replied, "Oh, I think it's completely appropriate, as it's well known that nothing makes an Englishman crap faster than the sight of George Washington." So perhaps strongly put, privateer investors saw their investments as a contribution to the war effort, and they saw their role as targeting the ideological hegemony of the British Empire. Every successful haul by a privateer was a symbol of the colonial withdrawal from that country, and the construction of a new identity, really. All right, then, let's see here. Privateering, the Mullica River and Little Egg Harbor. A good map here. So the Mullica River originates near Berlin in Camden County, flows approximately 80 miles across Atlantic Ocean and Burlington counties. The Batstow and the Wading River and Bass River drain into it, and it's only actually navigable for about 20 miles. This is a great early topo map showing Great Bay and the entrance into the Mullica. You can really see here what a navigational nightmare this river was for a British ship to negotiate without knowing the bends and the shoals, the way the privateers did, who operated out of Chestnut Neck and further up the river. I've sort of highlighted that route in red for you. Here's another topo map showing Chestnut Neck as well. And it's also, a bit further up to Batstow. You can see up there in the upper left-hand corner. And this is a really neat map from the 18th century that's a bit like a Google bird's eye map, flying into the Mullica from the ocean, from the east, and seeing things on a tangent. So it's amazing when you consider that this river really played such a large and, until the last few decades, unsung but critical role in creating the democratic experiment that we're all today still a part of. And as I mentioned, there are quite a few books out now that are starting to deal with this in depth. It's really not an exaggeration to say that the activities that occurred along this river during the Rev War not only ensured that the Continental Army had access to supplies, but also provided safe harbor for a generation of privateers who were exceptional at keeping the British constantly on their toes and wary of traveling the coastline with anything less than apprehension, really, sometimes outright trepidation, and certainly a bit of pathological anxiety. Communities along this river and patriot families supported the war effort from the beginning and before. And though certainly many, if not all of them, to some degree, were involved in privateering to make a profit, make no mistake that those who supported privateering were operating from an ideological place, and the risks they were taking were in the ultimate interest of, shaking off British rule and, as I mentioned, establishing nationhood and a new identity. The people that lived in this area already had a history, as I'd mentioned, of resistance and pushback and what's been referred to as the smugglers' woods in this area and the swamp men who inhabited them have a history that extends way back into the 18th century. When folks in this region and along the coastline first began to actively resist the collection of British customs duties, these kinds of attributions came into play. The Mullica River in particular was navigable by light ship for miles inland, and its twists and turns were torturous for ships that didn't know the channel like the back of their hands. It was early on a smuggler's paradise, and rough-cut roads appeared early on, leading from small settlements along the river through the forest to places like Philly and Trenton. In the beginning, molasses, rum, and sugar were some of the most valued commodities trafficked through the Mullica by privateers and other clandestine ports. So much so that John Adams later remarked that molasses was the essential ingredient of our independence. Much of the early smuggling effort in the Mullica drainage was rooted in that nascent colonial resistance to taxation without representation, and was carried out in direct defiance of British attempts to dictate and manipulate the colony's domestic and foreign economy. So place names that you may likely be familiar with that were engaged in or associated with early and later smuggling enterprises include places like Clark's Landing. It was located on the south bank of the Mullica below the Forks, and is reported to have had about 40 dwellings and 200 inhabitants in about 1718. So this has been disputed, with that number doubling within 20 years, also disputed. And perhaps not surprisingly, it had an active trading post and a log church. It was Lower Bank, and as we mentioned earlier, Lower Bank is near the site of Mullica's original homestead when he moved from Tacony. And by some accounts, the village was reported to have had 7 or 8 taverns at one time, which seems pretty intense, and only 100 permanent inhabitants. So if true, this immediately tells you something about the pedestrian traffic coming off the river. This is a historic photograph of the Lower Bank Methodist Episcopal Church, which was built in 1879. The congregation itself was established in 1780. And there was a place of worship and a meeting house that preceded this one that was built in 1842. Both of these structures still stand today. And Lower Bank is a really interesting little place and quite beautiful, and still retains, a lot of that kind of that charm, basically. It still has a real sort of ancient vibe to it. I recommend that you visit. So there was Mordecai's Landing, which was located on the north shore of the Mullica and was originally founded by folks from the Little Egg Harbor area, specifically a gentleman named Mordecai Andrews, who had a thriving timber business there. Pleasant Mills was another town, was probably established somewhere in the vicinity of 1707, and Elijah Clark had built his home there in 1762 after buying parcels several years before. Of course, you're likely aware that this residence still exists, the Elijah Clark House. The boundaries and the founding periods of Pleasant Mills and Sweetwater in that area seem to blend in the sources at times, as does the story of Kate Aylesford, brought to life in an 1855 novel by Charles Peterson. This is the Elijah Clark House. It's also known as the Kate Aylesford Mansion, and has also erroneously, I believe, been called Sweetwater. So the character of Kate Aylesford from this area is believed to be based on the daughter of patriot Richard Westcote, who I'll mention again, who purchased the house from Elijah Clark in early 1779. Though to confuse matters, some of Henry Charlton Beck, who is the grand historian of the Pines, had early informants in the 1930s that said Aylesford was based on the daughter of Honoria Reed, and the Reeds were another early family that had settled in the area. This mansion is quite beautiful. If you ever get a chance again to get into this area and kind of poke around, you'll see it. So Sweetwater, as I mentioned, it was another area associated with privateering along the Mullica. It was originally a place where the Lenape had a summer village called Nescohag, probably mispronouncing that. Henry Charlton Beck tells us that a group of Covenanters attempting to establish religious persecution in England came to what would eventually become Sweetwater around 1707, which matches the founding date for Pleasant Mills. Some of the family surnames associated with those early settlers were the Baxters, the McGilliams, the Pecks, the Campbells, and a bit later on, the Reeds. These early settlers built a log chapel here and cabins, and quickly became part of the landward resource distribution network that was already developing along the Mullica from smuggling efforts. The area was also said to have been visited multiple times by both of the renowned traveling Methodist preachers, John and David Brainerd, who had made it their cause to convert the Lenape. John Brainerd eventually became the in-house minister for the Brotherton Lenape Reservation, which encompassed portions of present-day Indian Mills. This was the first Indian reservation in the colonies and the only one ever established in New Jersey. Again, there's a great book on the subject by George Fleming, if you're interested. And I am actually currently working on coordinating archaeological investigations out there in the near future to assist in identifying the location of Brainerd's cabin, as well as the homesteads of some of the Lenape residents that were there. The present village of Sweetwater also at one time encompassed the small 18th century village of the Forks, which I'll mention again. And there's another quick, interesting Sweetwater note. I met a wonderful couple at another presentation a few years ago who told me they've been doing some landscaping on their property in Sweetwater, down the road from the old St. Mary of the Pines churchyard there. During the course of their landscaping, they'd unearthed an interesting object and they invited me down to take a look at it. And what they came across was this. It's a conglomerate stone. It was quite heavy, or I would have moved it out of the dappling sun, basically. But it's got the letters J, M, C, and 1742 carved into the obverse, and the letter T carved on the reverse. And it's really fascinating. It's unclear really exactly what it is. And my guess is that it might be a property boundary marker. So there's plenty of fruitful research still to be done in this area in the way of map and deed research. Let me show you the reverse of it. You can see the T there on the reverse. Even some of these hyper-developed properties along the Mullica, it's like they were just doing some landscaping, and the material remains of some of these 18th century communities, and the residents are there, like waiting to be found. So I thought that was quite fascinating. So Nesco and Westcoatville are adjacent to each other along the Hamilton Pleasant Mills Road. Nesco was originally known as New Columbia, and the 18th century Indian Cabin Tavern was likely situated within its limits. The tavern was one of the several million places in this part of New Jersey claimed to have been robbed by the outlaw Joe Mulliner, who I'm sure many of you have heard tale of. Westcoatville was named for that guy I mentioned earlier, Richard Westcoat, a local and compatriot of Elijah Clark, who not only assisted in funding the fortification of Chestnut Neck, but was heavily involved in financing local privateers, buying ships that had been taken from the British, refitting them, and sending them back out to wreak havoc. His near where Indian Cabin Road connects with Pleasant Mills Road, just above the Forks, and it was the site of a flourishing auction site for privateer ships and contraband cargo. Westcoat was about as involved in privateering in the Mullica as one could possibly get. Some of the other are often called on the Mullica are Thomas Clark of Clark's Landing, that was Elijah Clark's father, John Ridgway, and quite a few of the Mathises, a family that still has many descendants in the region today. Again, see Pierce's Heart of the Pines for local family names. So it wasn't until Britain began to crack down and actively set out to enforce customs laws with extreme prejudice in the mid-18th century that smuggling in the region, which would soon become privateering with the advent of the Rev War, would really become a concerted and highly organized and efficient enterprise. The Mullica, with all of its natural characteristics that I touched upon before, small harbors, frustrating bends, treacherous shallows, quickly became perhaps the most valuable waterway for privateers in New Jersey. The area called the Forks had been a major hub for inland commerce, as I'd mentioned, almost as soon as people settled in the area. The Mullica had been linked to the region and beyond prior to the Rev War by a network of taverns, also known as cradles of revolt by the British, at places like the previously mentioned Indian Cabin and Nesco, with additional tavern sites located in Lower Bank, Pleasant Mills, and Blue Anchor, to name a few. A tavern owned by a gentleman known as Old Zack originally displayed a sign showing King George III on horseback. After the war became a hot war, Old Zack reportedly took the sign down, painted over the king, and replaced him with a picture of George Washington. Old Zack was very involved in local civics, and it's known that he occasionally acted as the auctioneer, selling captured privateer goods at Richard Westcoat's home at the Forks along the Mullica. Taverns in the Mullica area were, like those in Boston or Philadelphia, the places where the revolution was fomented. People gathered there to talk, exchange information, get folks up on the news, and exchange ideas. Taverns were an extraordinarily important catalyst for the resistance. Often associated with them are these small harbors, of course, associated with villages such as the aforementioned Clark's Landing and Mordecai Landing, which gave shelter to small, fast vessels that were more often than not engaged in slipping contraband past the British and the noses of the custom agents. So again, I'm sure, sorry, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Chestnut Neck, or as the British called it, a nest of rebel pirates at Little Egg Harbor. In 1777, before the British determined to deal with it once and for all, Chestnut Neck consisted of a handful of houses, the ubiquitous tavern, and buildings to hold the huge stores of contraband that were coming off the Atlantic through the actions of the privateers. The permanent inhabitants of Chestnut Neck at the time reads like a who's who of the region: Adams, Bowens, Davis, Giberson, Higby, Mathis, Smith, and Suy, to name but a few. Makka Smith was notorious to the British and revered by the patriots for his daring and his sailing skills. Another highly active privateer worth mentioning is Colonel Richard Summers. After the incidents at Lexington and Concord, Summers, who was already firmly in the patriot camp, formed what was known as the Egg Harbor Guard to prevent loyalists from commandeering salt mills and other provisions for use by the British. The Egg Harbor Guard became known as the 3rd Battalion of the Gloucester County Militia, which patrolled areas like Ocean City and Brigantine during the war, and had even built a small fort called Fort Clark in Atlantic City, which was across from where the present day Coast Guard station is. Summers and his unit were very active during the war, and many of his compatriots and members of the battalion are buried in small cemeteries throughout the Pinelands. I did a presentation last year on the Head of the River Church and Cemetery down in Estelle Manor, and while I was taking photographs there, I came across quite a few of Summers' war buddies there. If you ever have a chance to check that place out, it's pretty amazing. Summers' son Richard was born just weeks before the Battle of Chestnut Neck, and to say that he became a bit of a tough guy would be an understatement. He was reportedly involved in 3 duels during the course of one day to defend his honor against aspersions cast upon it by several men who had heard a private joke between him and another famous naval person, Stephen Decatur, and they deemed it an insult. The irony was that after he won the first 2 duels, he actually had to be held up for the 3rd one, which he also won. But the guy who held him up was his friend Stephen Decatur, who was basically the catalyst for the duels to begin with. So the younger Summers went on to become the master commandant of the schooner Nautilus and later commander of the fire ship Intrepid during the First Barbary War. Also known as floating volcanoes, this was a tactic of stuffing a ship full with explosives and then ramming it into a target, the expectation being that the crew would get to safety before the charges went off. The Intrepid blew up before it was supposed to during its planned attack in Tripoli in 1804, and Summers and his crew were killed and are actually still buried there in Libya. His family wants his remains returned, of course, and this is still ongoing in diplomatic channels between the US and Libya. Ironically, Summers goes to Tripoli and dies in Tripoli as part of a now formalized US Navy fighting pirates who are harassing US merchant lines at sea. And it's interesting how the tables turn. You know, the definition between privateer and pirate can be a thin one. Local defenses along the coastline and near the Mullica preceded the Chestnut Neck incident. There was a small mud fort called Fort Tucker, and it appears that it was financed by Westcote and Clark, who were ultimately paid back by the New Jersey legislature for its setup. And as I mentioned, these two were making money hand over fist from their privateering efforts, and there were quite a few ventures that they had their hands in, including the purchase of cannon for defense along the Mullica and out in the inlet. So back to Chestnut Neck. By 1778, Chestnut Neck again is a settlement and a harbor in the process of being fortified after these continuing British raids in the Little Egg Harbor Inlet. As far as we know, there were approximately 11 domestic dwellings at the site, a tavern, of course, and 3 or 4 warehouses where cargo was pulled off the captured ships. The British had sent multiple ships to Chestnut Neck to try retrieving ships. It was built. When Goose puts it, there were 18 straws that broke the proverbial camel's back. And in the summer of 1778, privateers were in a frenzy, capturing and hauling 18 British transport ships up the Mullica. By this time, the merchant shipping insurance costs had tripled, And this flurry of activity drove the British just completely nuts. And they finally decided that enough was enough with Chestnut Neck and the privateers. The plan was to head up the Mullica, take out the village, and then proceed on to Batstow to cripple Washington's critical munitions supply. This is Sir Henry Clinton, who was the British commander-in-chief of American operations after the unexpected resignation of General Howe in 1778. Philadelphia was occupied at the time, and Clinton stepped into the city for Howe and decided to move the main body of the army north to New York, fighting a battle along the way with Washington's army at Monmouth Courthouse, portions of which had just spent the last winter in Valley Forge. After not faring so well at Monmouth, Clinton arrived in New York, and after almost getting into a major engagement with the French, who were sort of ghosting the coastline at the time, Clinton had a major bee in his bonnet about the privateers, which he'd been nursing for some time. Initially, he decided that he was tactically against the strategy of taking troops and ships up into the Mullica, but the powers that be in Britain pressed him on it. And his thoughts initially were that the fight against patriots should be taken out into the wilderness, sort of eradicating the places and the hidden routes and storehouses where material originating from places like Chestnut Neck was ultimately winding up at. So reluctantly, Clinton gave the order and assembled the flagship Zebra, the Nautilus, the Greenwich, the Granby, the Dependence, the Cornwallis, the Vigilant, the Experiment, and two unidentified transports at Staten Island on September 30th, 1778. Ultimately, British forces, including loyalists who lived in the area, numbered about 1,700, and the American numbers hovered somewhere under 1,000. The American spy network was aware that something was about to happen, but no one was quite sure what. Clinton took advantage of this and moved a huge number of troops into North Jersey as a ploy, but Washington, who was up in Fishkill, New York at the time, didn't fall for it. And he recognized pretty quickly what Clinton was up to. Militia and regular army units were alerted, and troop movement toward the area began. Ships and troops were under the command of Captain Henry Collins, and troops under the command of Captain Patrick Ferguson, not to be confused with Colin Ferguson, who most historians agree was not yet born at the time of the Battle of Chestnut Neck. So this is Patrick Ferguson. He was a Scotsman. He was known for the invention of the Ferguson rifle, which was capable of firing 6 shots a minute, which at this time was a real game changer. Ferguson rifles were used quite a bit in the American theater by the British. Ferguson had lost the use of his right arm at the Battle of Brandywine, and also had a chance to change history forever, but didn't know it at the time. While he was on a patrol at Brandywine, he spotted 2 American soldiers on horseback in the distance, one with a large, curious hat. And he had a clear bead on both of them, but decided it would be ungentlemanly to simply snipe at them from afar. Both men suddenly became aware of his presence, wheeled off on their horses, and Ferguson later learned that the man he had in his sights with the funny hat was Washington himself on the battlefield. One wonders, outcomes may have been quite different had he taken that shot. So back to Chestnut Neck. A storm caused the British to take almost 4.5 days to get to the Little Egg Harbor. And by this time, intelligence had allowed that most of the privateers to get their ships into open water and move most of the cargo stored at Chestnut Neck inland or further upriver to safer locations. It also provided the opportunity for American troops and militia to muster. And the British finally arrived in Great Bay on October 5th, 1778. The following day, the Zebra, Vigilant, and Nautilus made it over the sandbar into the mouth of the Mullica with only 12 miles of torturous sailing left to go. The British arrived at Chestnut Neck in the afternoon of October 6th, and the British met with little resistance. They lost no troops, and the fort itself had been constructed to rake the waterline of incoming ships, but it was lightly manned, and several gun embracements along the ridgeline had no artillery. While resistance at the fort itself was minimal, British reconnaissance forays up the river met with militia resistance near the forks. And they quickly realized that the planned trip up the Mullica to take out Batstow would have been just completely disastrous for multiple reasons. So you add to this the lack of knowledge of the geometry of the Mullica and the knowledge that Pulaski's legion was on its way to the area. The British did find 10 stolen vessels at Chestnut Neck, including the Venus. The decision was made to dismantle and burn those ships in place, as attempting to get them back down the Mullica would have been a logistical nightmare. They quickly realized they had bitten off more than they could chew, and they headed out of the estuary. So as I mentioned, Casimir Pulaski and his troops were on their way to support the privateers. They'd been called out by Washington and sent down from Trenton. And if you heard that Pulaski was coming, you took it seriously. This guy was really quite formidable and a fearless soldier. He'd already proven himself at the Battle of Brandywine, and also having fought in skirmishes in Germantown in Philadelphia. He was considered one of the greatest horsemen in the Continental Army, and he was also an expert swordsman. I'll come back to him briefly in a minute. This is a contemporary British description of the Battle of Chestnut Neck by Captain Henry Collins. Quote, "They, being the patriots, ranged themselves in a breastwork they had erected on an eminence, and showed themselves in a battery, which we afterwards found had no guns, but were soon disordered by a well-managed fire from the galleys, the troops landing immediately under the protection of the gunboats, and a cannonade of the galleys soon drove them from their works, and made them disperse to the woods without a loss. The vessels at this place, amounting to 10 in number, we found were mostly British, which had been seized upon by the rebel cruisers. Amongst them was the Venus of London, and others of considerable size, which they could not carry higher up the river. As all of them were scuttled and dismantled, and some sunk, it was impossible, notwithstanding my solicitude to recover the property of the king's subjects, to get down here. I therefore ordered them destroyed and fired. The storehouses and settlements here, so particularly adapted to the convenience of this nest of lowly freebooters, I was of the opinion with the commanding officer of the troops should also be destroyed, which was accordingly done. Also the battery and the work on the hill," end quote. So on its way back out of the Mullica, the British flagship Zebra was stranded in the shoals, and this caused the Brits to wait for better weather and the tide to rise. And ultimately, they were unable to get the Zebra afloat again, and Collins would ultimately order her burned on October 20th. Prior to this, however, the waiting there behind the bar provided them with opportunities for mischief, and several forays were made by the British into the countryside at that time to demolish Patriot stores, as well as salt manufacturing centers. Just a quick note on that, too. So salt and privateering are inexorably linked. In fact, salt works were in the planning stage at Chestnut Neck before the attack. It was the ultimate anti-British operation there, ships to luxury goods, weapons to salt. Domestic salt making was in great demand during most of the Red War because of British blockades, and Congress was so worried about salt that in 1776, they offered a bounty of about $0.33 for producing 1 bushel of salt. So remember, there was no refrigeration, right? And salt was needed to cure meats and to keep things from spoiling. It was critical. I mean, not to mention the fact that you need salt to live. So salt workers were so important, and the ones that worked along the coastline were actually exempted from military service, much like the workers at Batstow. Salt works were like a whack-a-mole because of their necessary proximity to the sea, and as fast as the British attacked them, another one would pop up. There were salt works in Manasquan and further north, as well as salt works in the Mullica area, such as the Thomas Heston Works on Willets Island, and a smaller outfit owned by a gentleman named Nathaniel Petit. Salt work owned by Thomas Savage was built with bricks bought from Elijah Clark in Pleasant Mills, who I've mentioned, that were delivered by Richard Westcote, who I've also mentioned, almost certainly on a ship that he had nicked from the British. So this is the situation that was occurring while the Zebra was stuck behind the bar. The dispersal of privateer ships by British activity had provided low-hanging fruit for British raiding parties while waiting to break free into the bay. And salt works were easy to harass and a good target before Pulaski might arrive. This slide here, some of the salt works were run by pumps that were powered by small windmills. And water was pumped up into these sluices, basically into the sun pans, what were called sun pans, and where it was evaporated. And they were also boiled off in kettles with capacities as large as about 900 gallons. So this was a huge industry at the time, and really critical to the colonial effort. So Pulaski's advance guard had reached the area around the 8th, set up camp along Island Road at the Ridgeway Farm, having rushed down from Trenton to meet the British threat. There was a deserter from Pulaski's Legion, a gentleman, well, can't call him a gentleman, a guy named Gustav Juliot, And he approached the British with this intelligence on October 12th and gave them information on the location of Pulaski's troops and wrongly claimed that Pulaski's orders were to provide no quarter to captured British personnel. In the early morning hours of the 15th, with this information, Captain Ferguson took about 200 troops and ambushed about 50 of Pulaski's men in the farmhouse there, killing all but a few who managed to escape into the woods. The main body of Pulaski's cavalry pursued, but the British made their way back across Big Creek and on their way dismantled the bridge behind them and were able to actually make their escape. Now, portions of Island Road through the salt marshes were what is called a Corduroy Road. And this is an archaeological example in this slide of a colonial Corduroy Road that's eroding out of a bank in Fairfield, Connecticut. This example is from around 1730. So these roads were emplaced with logs or branches across marshy topography and resulted in the appearance of the whale of corduroy fabric, hence the name. And you can see here that with a large group of motivated folks, as Ferguson's troops would have been, a road like this could be easily and quickly dismantled during a retreat and would cause particular problems for infantry that might be pursuing them. So despite the horror of the massacre, Pulaski and his men were able to range north and prevent any further damage by the British on their way out of Little Egg Harbor. There's a marker near the site of the massacre on Radio Road in Mystic Island Park. And the interesting thing about the deserter, Juliot, was that he had already defected from the Hessians to join Pulaski's Legion and then defected back again to the British side, providing the intel on Pulaski. And as you can imagine, this made him quite a hated man on both sides. So when he was returned to New York, Clinton considered executing him, but he eventually was sent on his way because no one could stand him. And ironically, he wound up later on working as a privateer for the British. So despite the actions of the British, the privateer harbor of Chestnut Neck was back in action not long after the attack. The village itself never returned, though Micajah Smith, John Smith, and Joseph Suey rebuilt homes there, which was a real thumb in the eye of the British. But within weeks of the incident there, privateers brought a captured British schooner, Two Friends, into the harbor. And in 1779, the British ship Triton was captured and sailed up the Mullica with its cargo, and an entire company of Hessian troops, a major and his officers, and 214 sailors as prisoners. As we've already noted, as part of the aftermath of the Chestnut Neck battle, there are reportedly at least 10 ships that were sunk that day to keep them out of privateer hands. And there is a memorial to the Battle of Chestnut Neck in Port Republic and a plaque identifying the names of most of the privateer players and the names of their ships who used the village as a home base for harassing the British. Notice the stone that this plaque is attached to as well is a conglomerate stone that is very similar to the field stone that I found in archaeological deposit in Sweetwater. Just a note. So basically it appears the privateers saw Chestnut Neck as a temporarily expendable asset. With advance warning of the British coming up the Mullica, they had plenty of time to get most of what was valuable to a safer place and then re-outfit the town in rapid fashion. My own thoughts on this are that from the British perspective, the attack on Chestnut Neck was ill-advised and poorly planned, but a real testament to how much damage the Mullica privateers were doing to the British economy. Even taking out the bad weather, why in the world would you send a ship like the Zebra, a brand new, fresh out of the shipyard, beautifully designed, state-of-the-art schooner, and multiple additional critical vessels up into the Mullica, admittedly without pilots who knew the turns in the river and the trends of the sandbar in the harbor, and no knowledge of what defenses the Patriots actually had at the fort? Why would you do that? I have to believe that some of it was ego and hubris, certainly on the part of Clinton, but also, as we've mentioned, probably just tremendous pressure from across the pond to get her done. Why in the world wouldn't they have at least planned it better? I mean, this honestly just kind of baffles me. They lost 10 ships. Granted, they deprived us of their use as well. And they also lost their flagship. In essence, they fought no one. There was no real battle there. They basically took the best of their fleet out for a joyride, were caught in the sandbar, and limped back to New York empty-handed and down multiple ships. I don't see this as a successful campaign for them at all. It's just my opinion. So scientists from the Stockton Marine Field Station have been instrumental in locating and mapping 3 of the scuttled wrecks. The Kramer, the Bead, and I believe it's the Pheel. What's pronounced the Pheel, P-H-O-E-L. Oops. Sorry about that. There you go. This slide actually shows those wrecks via side scan sonar. The bead is currently on the National Register of Historic Shipwrecks, but as you can see, it's in a state of pretty advanced deterioration. The Fiel and the Kramer are in significantly better shape, and I believe that individual nomination for each to the register is in the works, if it hasn't happened already. Prior to the incident at Chestnut Neck by 1766 and the initial establishment of Batstow Furnace, financiers like Charles Reed, who was also the customs agent at Burlington City, were well aware of what was going on along the Mullica, but couldn't do anything to stop it. In fact, in many instances, the customs agents were receiving kickbacks from the smugglers, as the alternative was soon to become tarring and feathering. This was an activity that became a regular occurrence on the docks at Philadelphia for customs agents and virtually anyone who challenged the forward progress of smugglers and privateers. By all accounts, tarring and feathering was not a benign event, and those who had it done to them would likely never forget the pain and humiliation of the experience. This is an 18th century image of the tarring and feathering of customs agent John Malcolm in Boston, perhaps by privateers, probably by privateers. So the caption is, "The Bostonians paying the excise man." The excise man was the tariff collector. This was actually the second time that they had done this to him. The next image goes a little bit further in the future, but just kind of shows you the impacts of this. This was a German farmer from Missouri during World War I who was tarred and feathered because of his lack of support for war bonds and subsequent accusation of being a German sympathizer. I mean, you can see from this horrible photograph that it just causes horrific burns and scarring. So the tensions between smugglers, customs agents, and the Crown increased exponentially as attempts to squeeze more and more funds out of the colonies reached absurd proportions. Smugglers and privateers along the coastline came up with creative solutions for avoiding these excise taxes or exploiting British supply ships. One innovative patriot privateer would tie a lantern to a mule on the beach and walk the mule in a circle to cause British ships to think they were seeing a lighthouse in the dark. Ships would subsequently crash on the sandbar and become easy pickings for raiders. So again, even before the time the Red War had finally arrived, smugglers along the Mullica had this long sort of pedigree and were legitimized inevitably by the granting of their letters of marque, which legally recognized their permission to acquire contraband for the war efforts, as they were now privateers. Even the lowest of the low on board a successful privateer ship stood to make a substantial amount of money if he or she played their cards right. A 14-year-old cabin boy aboard a privateer ship in 1779 was given the following things for just one tour of duty. Now imagine this. This is a 14-year-old kid. Goes out on one cruise. They give him $700, which is about $15,000 today. A ton of sugar, 35 gallons of rum, 20 pounds of cotton, 20 pounds of sugar, 20 pounds of ginger, 20 pounds of allspice, and 20 pounds of logwood. Now, one can only imagine this kid was pretty popular in school after this. The privateers of the Mullica were so successful during the war that a London Times article stated, "It seemed fated that the ignorance, incapacity, and cowardice of the Americans by land should be continually relieved in point of effect by their successes at sea." And you can hear that they seem a bit agitated. By 1780, years after the Chestnut Neck battle, there were literally hundreds of privateers still harassing the British supply lines from the Mullica River, with names such as the Rattlesnake, the Nancy, the Hazard, the Chance, Vixen, Revenge, and Alligator, to name a very few. The Alligator was owned by Joseph Ball, who was the manager of the Batstow Iron Works, and he was one of many that made a fortune during the war, both in privateering and in real estate. Because of his close proximity to the Forks and Westcote's auction gabble, he often had a chance to inspect newly captured ships firsthand, and he received inside information on their qualities. Along with the Alligator in 1778, Ball purchased the Industry and the Speedwell, as well as Polly's Adventure at Westcote's. Ball was also a partner in many other privateer vessels and was making money hand over fist. Many of these ships had paid a visit up the Mullica, and some had been refitted, auctioned, and put into action directly from its coves and harbors. Virtually any boat could be turned into a privateer, and whaling ships were often equipped with cannon and joined in the fray as frequently as sloops and brigantines. So, just to give you a sense of these things, the brigantine derives from the word from a thief or brigand, that prowled the seas in the 1500s and typically had two masts and square rigging on the foremast. Schooners and brigantines are pretty similar, except for the design of the hull and primarily, I think, sail shapes. I'm not a nautical expert by any stretch, but I do believe that to be true. Sloops are generally smaller and much more maneuverable. Here's a rigged whaleboat. You kind of see how small these things were. Privateer sloop. There's a brigantine. Okay, so to give you a sense of what was actually being pulled off of these ships, I just told you what the young privateer got when he finished up his term of duty. In 1780, at Westcote's Tavern near the Forks, a British ship called the Betsy was sold after having been captured with a cargo of tobacco, salt, coffee, mustard, and china. In 1778, the schooner Hannah, described as a floating department store, was taken with a cargo of china, linens, chintzes, diapers, hardware, frying pans, brushes, and a vast array of foodstuffs. In that same year, the sloops John and Sally were taken, loaded with rum and muscovado sugar, and in one of the great hauls that really catalyzed British determination to destroy Chestnut Neck, the capture of one of the Irish fleet flagships, Venus, by privateer Makka Smith, who we've seen his tombstone earlier, netted fine broadcloths, linens, calicos, chintzes, silks and satins, silk and thread stockings, shoes, medicines, books, hardware, beef, pork, butter, cheeses, and porter. And then, of course, there are the ships themselves, in addition to their cargo. This is a quote: "To be sold by public vendue on Monday, the 29th of this instant, at the house of Mr. Richard Westcote at the forks of Little Egg Harbor River, the prize brig Black Snake and the schooner Morning Star with their tackle and apparel, etc., captured by William Mariner, May 24, 1780. Peaceful shouting of sailors, the bang of the gavel at Westcote's frequent auctions, the rolling of barrels, and the ringing of bells, the sounds of captured ships being brought in against the bulkheads to the sound of applause and whistles. Friends Richard Westcote and Elijah Clark were both officers in the Gloucester County Militia when the war came, and as I've mentioned, became extraordinarily rich as a result of their privateering efforts. This is Westcote's grave in May's Landing. He was the privateer extraordinaire, near where he later in life operated a store. He lived to the age of 92, which is extraordinary in of itself, got through the Rev War and then the War of 1812. So you can just imagine the stories this guy must have told you if you stopped in and chatted him up. Westcote himself was with Washington's army when it crossed the Delaware, and he was severely wounded at the Battle of Trenton. Having returned to the Mullica, he was put in charge of the storehouses at the Forks and had thrown himself full-time into the privateering effort. Elijah Clark, again, himself a colonel in the militia, had also fought at Trenton as well as Princeton, and became a member of the New Jersey Assembly in 1777. The privateers that purchased ships from and screened goods through them engaged in what was tantamount to guerrilla warfare on the sea. Oftentimes, the ships that privateers took on were far superior in both fire and manpower, but because the privateers didn't play by the rules, they were frequently able to beat the odds against them through innovation and creativity. So I mentioned the donkey with the lantern earlier, and another tactic that privateers used to dupe British cargo ships was the installation of dummy wooden cannons on their ships to make them look more lethal than they actually were. The privateers became increasingly emboldened by their successes, and some of them became New Jersey legends. The stories are well documented. There's Captain Adam Hyler, a real character whose hunting grounds were actually a bit further north than the Raritan River. Hyler was about 40 years old when the Revolutionary War started, and it's possible that when he was younger, he had already been impressed into the British Navy, which basically means he was plucked from the community and put onto a boat and forced to serve. So this may have put a bee in this guy's bonnet already, and it set the tone for how he felt about the British. And by the time of the war, he was pretty well off and seems to have done his privateering in his spare time. He went on a tear for about a year from October of 1781 to August 1782, and he's perhaps known best for a particularly spectacular capture where he and his men approached a large cutter, a British cutter in an open rowboat, which was literally sitting next to the 64-gun British man-of-war Lion. This thing was gigantic. Here we see an image of the Lion in battle with a French ship of the line. These ships were formidable, and the Lion had only half the complement of cannons that these things could carry. There, I believe, a warship of this period had upwards of 120 cannon on board. Some of them, not all, but I think that they could carry that many. The cutter was no slacker itself and had a dozen 18-pound cannons. Hyler boarded the cutter from the rowboat, took 40 prisoners, and then brazenly proceeded to blow it up in front of the larger warship. And to add insult to injury, on his way home, he stopped to commandeer a British sloop that had crossed his path and demanded 400 pounds for its release, which he duly received. The following is a newspaper account of one of his exploits that occurred a month before his death. The British never captured him, and he died in his bed in November of 1781. This is the quote. October 7th, 1781. On Friday last, Captain Adam Hyler from New Brunswick, with one gunboat and 2 whaleboats, within a quarter of a mile of the guard ship at Sandy Hook, attacked 5 vessels, and after a smart conflict of 15 minutes, carried them. 2 of them were armed, one mounting 4 6-pounder cannons, and 1 6 swivels and 1 3-pounder. The hands made their escape with their longboats and took refuge in a small fort in which were mounted 12 swivel guns. From this they kept up a constant firing, notwithstanding which he boarded them all without the loss of 1 man. On board one of them was 250 bushels of wheat, a quantity of cheese belonging to Captain Lippincott, bound to New York. He took from the others 50 bushels of wheat, a quantity of cheese, 7 swivels, a number of fuses, 1 cask of powder, and some dry goods, and stripped them of their sails and rigging, not being able to bring the vessels into port in consequence of a contrary wind and tide. After which he set fire to all, save 1, on board of which was a woman and 4 small children, which prevented her from sharing a similar fate. So here's Lower New York Bay, which was basically the privateer playground for these guys. There's a privateer I mentioned earlier named William Mariner. He recaptured the American privateer ship Black Snake from the British with a 9-man crew on a refitted whaling boat. After successfully taking back the Black Snake, they ran into the British ship Morning Star, sporting 6 swivel guns and 33 men, which surrendered to them after suffering 3 killed and 5 wounded, whereupon Mariner took his prizes up into Little Egg Harbor. Mariner was a bold guy, and as I said, he's worked a bit further north near Sandy Hook and the Raritan River like Hyler did. And in fact, because of Hyler's daring, Mariner was occasionally blamed for Hyler's exploits. There's no indication whether or not he embraced these inaccuracies or was annoyed by them. My guess is the former. Despite working further north, from time to time, Mariner was known to bring prizes up the Mullica. He was also famous for attempting to kidnap the mayor of New York, David Matthews, who was a loyalist who had been dubbed the Tormentor General for his maltreatment of patriot and privateer prisoners. Overall, Matthews himself was a horrible person who was disliked by both patriots and loyalists alike for his more profound loyalty to self-preservation. He almost bought it early in the war when he was accused of attempting to murder Washington in 1776 in cahoots with one of Washington's bodyguards and the governor of New York. The bodyguard was executed, and nothing was ever proven about Matthews' participation in the plot. When the war was over, he fled to Nova Scotia and died in 1800. There's also a funny story from 1780 involving a privateer named Edward Giles, who was prowling the waters near Brigantine in his schooner the Shark when he was captured by a British coastal patrol. Giles was made prisoner on his own ship in his own cabin, but began trading stories with the officers put on board that had been put on board to guard him. He gained their trust, and he broke out a bottle of liquor and plied them with it until they were all stinking drunk. And seizing the opportunity, he recaptured the ship that had just been taken from him, and he took the inebriated officers up into Chestnut Neck and handed them over as prisoners. In Tom's River, another story of Captain Sam Bigelow, privateer who occasionally operated out of Chestnut Neck, pulled in multiple ships in 1780 from the Long Beach sandbar. He captured a British brig called the Dove on its way to New York with a cargo of 140 puncheons of rum. Puncheon is a type of barrel with an 84-gallon capacity. So basically, he captured a ship that was carrying 118,000 gallons of rum. So with that, we are at the end of this presentation. I hope that you have enjoyed it. American privateers are some of the unsung heroes of the Rev War, and probably did more to bankrupt the coffers and morale of the British war machine than almost any other group of patriot combatants. The Crown lost literally billions of dollars because of these privateers and privateering in general. And what's fascinating really is how critical New Jersey and particularly the Mullica River and Great Bay were to the privateering effort. In addition, and this would be an entire presentation in of itself, was how the techniques that they developed, the sailing, the rigging, the outfitting, tactics, decoy, etc., how these things would go on to sort of revolutionize naval tactics and shipbuilding and the development of the formal US Navy. So much so that during the War of 1812, the British actually began to copy several American naval designs. And so much of this American naval innovation had its roots in the MacGyvering of the colonial era privateers. Also, in a sense, the sort of regimented living, enforced punishments, and hierarchical system of living in a formal navy saw its egalitarian opposite in privateering in a way: camaraderie, economic potential for all, and this sort of burgeoning ideological purpose that became embodied in the privateer ethos. So that is it. And thanks for taking time out of your day-to-day to listen to my presentation. And again, feel free to email me with questions or thoughts regarding content or sources. Please stay healthy, safe, and well. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was great, Tony. Can you put up the question slide with the phone number to call in?
There we go.
All right.
I forgot about that one.
Awesome, Tony. That was a fantastic presentation. All kinds of information. I really enjoyed it, and I can't wait to go do some further reading now based on some of the new things I learned today.
Well, good. Thank you. There's a lot, it's when you turn a leaf over, you find something new in this topic. It's just it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's great to see all those interconnections of the different people and where their paths cross. It's pretty interesting.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's really neat. I mean, the cool thing about that presentation is you can go visit a lot of those places today. You can go to Batstow, you can go to Nesco, you can go over to Pleasant Mills. Like I said, Sweetwater, you can certainly go to Chestnut Neck and see the monuments. Down at the inlet area, down where Foxboroughs is still there today. So it's really neat to see that tie to today and back to how it was, a few hundred years ago.
Yeah, and you had said the other day that you fish out there by that old mud fort.
Yeah, I fish along Foxborough Bank all the time, and it's pretty neat to have that, the history behind those little names.
Yeah.
Funny enough, I still see a lot of foxes out there. You see foxes on the meadows all the time, and that's one of the spots I see the most of them.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, it blows my mind to kind of go down along the Mullica and just, it's so quiet and beautiful, and you just can't imagine, what it must have been like.
Okay, I have someone here with a question. You are live with your question.
Okay. Hey, how are you doing?
Hey, Tony, that was absolutely awesome.
Oh, no, thank you.
And your jokes are funny. I laughed at them out loud. So I had a question, just so I guess a general thing about privateers. I'm not sure you can answer it, but the privateer successes were so amazing. Do you attribute it to the fact that they did develop these new tactics, or was it because the British were at such a disadvantage coming all the way across the ocean and then having to fight battles?
It was both.
Did the British have places where they rested?
Were they what?
Were they rested, after the voyage? I would think it's a long voyage, right? So, I mean, or were they coming out of harbors that they held?
It was primarily the Brits were coming out of places that they had held already.
Okay.
The thing was with the colonists is they had basically created their own the colonists had created the downfall for the Brits because the Brits had used them and sort of promoted privateering against the French and the Spanish before the war. So they had already, a generation to kind of perfect these kind of techniques that they ultimately used against the British. And oh,
that's interesting.
Yeah. So the daring do was already there. No, go ahead.
My other question actually was about Mullica.
Mullica.
Yeah. Do you know anything about his second wife? Like you mentioned, he married again, but not who he married. I'm just wondering if she knew about this nice place on the Mullica River.
No, I could find nothing about her, though, it may exist in records somewhere. Again, it's just it's very limited information for that time period on him. And
of course.
yeah, I found nothing at all. But it's
interesting.
It's fascinating to imagine this guy just sort of picking up and, just like moving into the interior. I mean, there must have been a catalyst for it,
Yes, for sure. Well, anyway, the talk was great. I learned so much. I love the stories about the donkey going in circles, and that was great. I'm gonna tell all my friends. And the gentlemanly guy who wouldn't kill George Washington. That was really fascinating.
Okay.
I had no idea he had such a close call.
I'm hoping, as I couldn't hear it, I was hoping people were laughing on the other end. So
yeah, definitely. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Have a good one.
You too.
Yeah, there was a couple funny points along the way. Your jokes were quite long.
Good. Glad they worked. It's again, without feedback, it's always hard to know.
Yep.
Is that it?
I don't know. Maybe we'll give it another minute or so. I guess we're around 11:21. So.
Oh wow! Really? Jeez.
You definitely provided plenty of information, and we'll give maybe just a minute or so, just to make sure there's nobody else still hanging out there. But if you have a question, now would be the time to call in.
I probably drove them all off with my long presentation. I had no idea it was going that long. I apologize.
I don't know. Went pretty quick. So I could sit and listen to stories about history all day long. So
yeah, I hear you.
Yeah. All right, Tony, I want to thank you. Again, as I said before, it was a great presentation. I really learned a lot. I laughed a few times as well. So I appreciate your efforts. And
Great.
We got a person with calling. All right.
What's this?
We got another person.
Oh, okay.
Hello, you are live with your question.
Great, thanks. Great presentation. I really enjoyed that.
Great. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I like the humor. I'm a big fan of corny jokes.
I'm a dad. I
a lot of them myself. Also, really, I like just the insights into South Jersey history, where the place names come from, and the bios you gave us some of the privateers. It's all very interesting. I did have a question about possible sources. There's a gentleman by the name of Donald Grady Shomit who wrote a book called something like Privateers on the New Jersey during the American Revolution, Privateering on the New Jersey coast.
Oh wow!
And
okay.
I wondered if you were aware of it.
I'm not actually. I'm gonna write it down right now. Could you give it to me again?
Yeah, it's Shomettee.
Okay.
Donald Grady. It's on Amazon.
Okay.
And it's a pretty hefty book. I have put off buying it, but I'm kind of inspired by your presentation to reconsider, getting it.
When was it written?
I'm going to say I saw it in Barnes & Noble about 5 or 6 years ago, and it had just come out. I was a little surprised to see it there because it's a pretty specialized topic for most people. He's a marine architect by training, and he's no longer active, and he's been retired for some time. But so that's his background.
That's a great source. I appreciate it. there's sort of been a resurgence of interest in it, and there are a couple of great books and some master's theses that have been written recently on it.
Yeah. I can see that. It's an interesting topic, and one that really I think is going to reward further. So looking forward to seeing about it. But
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Would be a good, maybe further introduction for you. I mean, you're already obviously knowledgeable, and it would definitely, I think it would be rewarding to take a look at it.
Great. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I've not heard of it.
Yeah, I do have a question about the privateers' motivations. It seems in a way that they're up to the sorts of people who were participating in this before the revolution were already smuggling and so on. And I'm just wondering whether there was.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up there a little bit.
The war just kind of found them, and and they became moment. And I also wondered whether their activities continued after the war.
That's a really good question. I didn't come across any accounts of them of it, continuing. Though I'm sure it did to some degree. But I did miss a bit of what you were saying initially, your initial question. But I gathered that you were asking whether or not the sort of ideological circumstances kind of made it more of a venture that was less about money and more about kind of carving a nation. I mean, did I catch you right on that, or?
Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is whether the arrival of the war transformed, at least on the surface, their clear economic motivation into a more of an ideological motivation.
Yeah. Yes.
Relatable.
That's my understanding. My understanding from what I've read is that is, what many believe is happening, that I sort of agree with. I mean, it's kind of a hypothesis, really.
So the privateers would have truly, their motivations would have actually changed on a personal level.
Yeah, I think so. Because I did run into some accounts, of folks that took a particularly valuable ship and would simply take prisoners and kind of hold it in place until the Navy could come and get it. So there is this sort of like sacrifice of financial gain from time to time that people are exhibiting, that privateers are exhibiting, right. That shows that they're in it for the ideology as well as the money. And certainly that wouldn't have been all of them. I'm sure there were folks who were, just making money hand over fist and didn't care one way or the other who won, or who didn't. But I do think a large amount of them did sort of pick up on that ideological slant and ran with it.
Well, passing on the entire contents of a vessel to the government really is a pretty clear signal. Yeah.
Because you see what the amount of money you could make from one of these ships. I mean, literally, you could be set for life basically for one successful capture. I love that story of the 12-year-old kid. And it's like, imagine coming back to your home at 12 years old, and you basically are a king. I mean, it was hundreds of thousands of, if not $1 million worth of materials that you could distribute amongst your community and take care of your mom and dad.
Right. I can picture him arriving at home and saying, "Okay, Dad, things are going to be a little different around here from now on."
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much, and I hope that as you do your researches, you continue to present on the online.
Yeah. Thanks for the source. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet.
Take care now. Be safe.
You too. Bye-bye.
Okay. We did have a couple other people buzz in, but they've since checked back out.
Okay.
That was a good question. That's an interesting point. There were definitely was privateers on both sides. So there was a lot of, for the cause was pretty important, but you can't really, shortchange what a financial opportunity it was.
Yeah.
If you had the means and the money at the time, it was a great thing to get involved in to increase your fortune. And we certainly can see that up and down the shore.
Yeah, indeed.
All right, Tony, I'm going to sign off now. I think it was a great job, and I thank you again, and excellent presentation.
Thank you very much. Talk to you soon.
All right. Good one.
Take care now.